All right. Good evening. For those of you on the East Coast, good late afternoon for everybody on the West Coast. Tonight we're going to start chapter 2. This is we're going to start getting into the soul, what the soul is all about. And we'll focus mainly on the godly soul, what the godly soul is. So I had a teacher who he didn't like to speak so much outside. He said, I don't like to use my own words so much. I'd rather try to cover ground. And I would like to do that, but then I tend to not do that. So I'll at least try to start off that way. Nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael hu chelik elikah mimal mamash. The second soul in a Jew is literally a portion of God. Now we can tear apart every single word over here, which some do, and I won't. But why does it say the second soul? The second soul is a chelik elikah. The godly soul is the second soul. It's the guest in the house. When a person is born, if we remember, he's born with an animal soul right away. The mere fact that you're alive, a human is alive, he has an animal soul. Not bad, as I always like to say. It's not bad, just animalistic. That's all. It has instinct. A baby knows to breathe. A baby knows to eat and look for milk and all these beautiful things. There's certain instincts that it has. Those are animalistic. The godly soul, only a little bit of the godly soul is in there, and it slowly becomes meluvash, enclosed into its proper place, which is in the mind. And that culminates when the child is 12 if it's a girl and 13 if it's a boy. That's why we celebrate a bar mitzvah. And that's why a person is not, a boy in particular, is not held liable for any wrongdoing until he's about the age of 13. Parenthetically, if you want to know, as an insider, I can tell you it's not really until you're 20. If you study enough, you find that little gem over there. So don't worry about what happened when you were 17. But 13 is when you become sort of liable, so to speak, because you're fully aware. In other words, that struggle over the body, over what's called the nefesh hasichlis, which we'll talk about. There's a kind of a third soul, but it's part of the animal soul. It's called the nefesh hasichlis, which literally means the soul of understanding. The body, the godly soul, the animal soul, and the godly soul are trying to take over what they call the city. They're like two generals trying to take over the city. The body is called the city, and the ear, ayin yud resh, ear, not like ear in Hebrew, a city, and that fully starts taking control, fully starts happening. The combat really starts happening when you're 13. I just want to say a little Dvar Torah over here that's connected very well to this week's, what we're learning right now. We know that Rivka had twins in her belly, right? She had Yaakov and Esau, Jacob and Esau. And the Gemara said, and the Torah says that every time they would pass, the Gemara says, Rashi brings it down, that every time they would pass a place of avodah zarah, of idol worship, Esau would start kicking and he would want to get out. And every time they passed the place of Torah study, right? Torah study existed then, the yeshiva of Shem and Aver. It was a place of Torah study. Yaakov would try to get out because he would want to go to that place. Now we have this concept of nature and nurture. So a person's nature, is it really that different than their parents? If you have two very calm parents, of course there are certain tendencies that a child could have that would be very different. But for the most part, when we're dealing with somebody like Yitzchak and Rivka, when Mashiach comes, it says Yitzchak is going to be the choicest of the avos, of the forefathers. Right now, Avram is the choicest. Yaakov and Yisrael are choice. Yeah, Yaakov and Yisrael, the same person. And Yitzchak, he's always known as Gevura, to be stringent. He never traveled outside of the land of Israel. He was very strong. Him and his wife bickered a lot. We'll talk about that at some point. And he was very cerebral, but holy nevertheless, very holy. And Rivka, I mean, she came from, Lavan's house. I mean, she was like the Gemara says she was a rose amongst the thorns. How could they have produced someone like Esau? Such an inclination towards evil. And if you want to say, okay, look, she came from Lavan, who was a very bad guy. So she has this recessive gene in her. Chassidus and Kabbalah don't really accept that. They say it's a very hard thing to say. She was pretty much 100%. She was 100% good through and through, blue and blue through and through. So how could Esau have been the way he was? And how is Yaakov the way he was? What the Torah was teaching us is that to be born with a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination, certain feelings towards something, that's just as holy as Jacob. It's okay. Jacob felt completely holy and he had an inclination towards godliness, elokus, kedusha, and Esau wanted avodah zarah. Well, that's okay. They were just as holy as one another. Don't think that one was more holy than the other. The reason Esau, what the Gemara says, the Zohar says there are two modes of life. It's called Hasidim Hamelua. They always, I think I might be misquoting a little bit, but they go up. They're always ascending. A Chassid, there's a person who's always ascending up. And then there's one that's called a Kivosh Yitzra, someone who's always conquering their Yetzer Hara. I think we can relate to the second one. But both modes are modes of service of God, and they're both equally as important and as productive and effective and precious in the eyes of God. So Jacob was of the one that was always ascending. He was always involved in Kedusha and holiness and ascending. He didn't have to suppress or conquer any negative trait within him. Fine. That's one mode of service. But then there's the Esau mode of service, where Esau, for most of his life, until he got into his 30s, he was always able to suppress and subdue his Yetzer Hara. And God took great pleasure in that. And Yitzchak took great pleasure in that and saw the power of that. That is most of us. We're that, if not all of us. That is who we are. We're always this one that's trying to suppress and really conquer and overcome our Yetzer Hara. You might say the Yetzer Hara seems to be a bad thing, right? It's not. It's a creation of Hashem. And we know that Hashem, Hamachadish B'tuvoi, B'chol Yom Tamid, Hashem recreates the world at every moment within his attribute of kindness. The mere fact, that is a very fundamental concept in Chassidus that you have to really drill into your head. And it's very logical that God created the world and the foundation is kindness. God created the world. Kindness means I'm giving whether you deserve it or you don't deserve it. I'm just giving. I'm a giver. Gevura means I'm limiting that amount of giving, which is a healthy thing to do, right? If a child wants to play with a knife, it's not very healthy just to give him a knife because you want to be very healthy. I mean, you want to be kind. Candy, giving someone candy, or just feeding their drug addiction, or let's just give him what he wants. Just give him more and more. That's not called kindness necessarily. That's not what's called true kindness. It has to be tempered with gevura. However, the attribute of kindness is kind. That is what Torah would define as kindness, just constantly giving. God created the world. There was nobody there to elicit that feeling to want to give. Yeah, a lot of times we want to give because we want to attach ourselves to somebody. We want to emulate. We want to get close to somebody. We feel a debt of gratitude to somebody. So therefore, we want to pay them back, so to speak, almost. There's something about them that's drawing you out to give something to them. God is that really kindness? I don't know if that's really considered kindness. But when God decided to create the world, there was nobody to elicit, there was no being to elicit that feeling from him. He completely gave, he's constantly giving. He completely gave on his own volition. He just decided to create somebody else in order to give. So therefore, everything is created from his attribute of goodness and kindness, everything from what's called yeah, okay. God gives it from his attribute of chesed, of kindness. So therefore, everything in this world is good, stemming from his attribute of good. So even the Yetzer Hara comes from a place of good. So what's the possible? What is so good? Well, it's like about the Yetzer Hara. Says the Zohar, it's like a harlot who is hired to trick the prince into like seduction, but she really wants him to overcome the temptation. She was hired by the king or by his friend, I don't know, the king, I know the whole story, so that the son would become stronger and withstand it. Now, it's not like Gandhi over here, who I heard slept naked with his niece or whatever. We don't play these kinds of games. It's a metaphor. But the Yetzer Hara has its goodness, just like the Satan. People mistake that Satan, the Satan, is something, this negative force against godliness. That's not true. He's completely batal, he's completely nullified to God. Everything is completely, all angels are completely nullified to God and completely doing God's will. Same thing, the Yetzer Hara is doing its job. It's nullified to God's will, just like the sun and the sky and the moon and everything else. Angels, it's completely nullified to God's will. I think that's very important to understand, because a lot of us have this feeling, I have such evil thoughts and evil desires, things which I can't, unlike other people, I try to talk to other people about it and they can't understand how dark of a place I feel and all these different. There's a Torah and says the story and from Yitzchak and Rivka and Yaakov and Esav, you're designed that way, and that's okay. The only thing you're not allowed to do is act upon it. We all have things, and it's a spectrum. It's of how dark and disturbing perhaps they could be, or negative they could be. Maybe they're less disturbing and less dark and whatnot. Nevertheless, it's your job to overcome that, do your best in overcoming that desire, the Yetzer Hara. And you have the ability. It says Hashem does not give a test, he does not give a challenge that a person can't overcome, that the one he's giving it to cannot overcome. It says in the Gemara. And I think that's a very powerful statement. It's very hard to live by that. It's very hard to understand that. It's an accepted, but nevertheless, it's a truth that we need to aspire to. And sometimes the battle just keeps raging. And as we learned in chapter 1 about the Beinoni, and we're really getting into in chapters 12, 13, 14, it only gets stronger and stronger. The more you try to conquer your Yetzer Hara, the stronger it becomes, because you've become stronger, just like lifting a weight. You have to up the ante. And then sometimes it just comes at you like Mayim Rabin, it says, wild waters, a tremendous amount of water, a rush, like a tsunami, like a hurricane. It's constantly coming. And you're getting closer, and then you reach the eye of the storm, and you're like, oh, I think I'm pretty. You don't realize that you're in the eye, but you're like, oh, it's pretty calm in here. And then bam, hits you again, and then it's raging. You have to wait for the storm to pass, and that could take months. It could take a very long time. But nevertheless, you have the ability to keep going through it. And why? What's going on over here? And then this first line really gives you a great insight that the default of a person is his animalistic instincts, the animal soul. That's the default. When you wake up in the morning, I just heard a great like a great metaphor, very practical. When you wake up in the morning, you're very hungry, and you go downstairs and you go to eat breakfast, whatever. Which part of you wants that breakfast? The godly soul or the animal soul? Well, it depends. If you just wake up and you're just hungry and you go downstairs and you want to eat, that's your animal soul. It's instinctive. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not godly. And what we're trying to do is become godly. And the default is so much easier because that's the default. That's exactly what default is. The nefesh hashenis, the guest in the home, the second soul, came much later. It didn't even fully come down to 13 years. You know how conditioned a child is? By the time he's 13, his trajectory towards life, what's normal, what feels good, what feels normal, what feels right. You have to undo, you have to unlearn so much by the time the second soul comes in to the body, so to speak. Now, hopefully you try to educate the child well, even before it has, teach the nefesh bahamis, the animal soul. The animal soul only wants to do what's good for itself. If you can convince, and the whole point is to convince the animal soul that serving God is, you'll enjoy it even from a logical perspective. It's much better for you than serving yourself. And serving, as I always say, what gives you more joy when you go to a comedy club and someone makes you laugh, or if you make somebody else laugh? If you're the comedian on stage, the comedian on stage is having a much greater time than you're having when you get up, especially when you elicit a laugh, because he's giving of something. When you give, because you're emulating God, you enjoy it much more. So you can convince the animal soul even as a child. But just think about it. The child is after 13 years, is so conditioned to the way it is. The animal is like, this is normal, this is good. And then you're trying to convince me at the age of 13, here, finally, the guest has completely come into the door. He's trying to convince me otherwise. You can understand why the struggle is real and the struggle is tough. But the point is, just by you being able to identify, what the Tanya trying to do is to let you know that all these feelings that you have and these machshavas, these thoughts that you have, it's totally normal. And you need to identify when it's coming from a place of selfishness or a place of selflessness, true selflessness, godliness. As we'll soon learn, that the godly soul is like an angel, so to speak. And we'll see where it comes from, and it doesn't feel its own existence. It's just like an angel. Yeah, you'll find often in Torah, an angel will appear to so and so, and they'll ask the angel, "What's your name? Tell me your name." And the angel says, "I have no name." Meaning, what does that mean? The angel has no identity outside of serving God. Its whole existence is an extension of God. I don't have a name. I only need a name if I need you to call me upon something, if I need a sense of identity. I have no identity. I'm a ray of the sun emanating from the sun. A ray of the sun has no identity outside light, and we're going to get into very much, you'll find very often, or and ma'or, light and luminary. That's very fundamental in Chassidus and in Kabbalah. What is light? Light just tells you that there's something. It emanates from from the luminary itself. There's a source of light. I am nothing more than a messenger, so to speak, of the source of light. I am the source of light coming to you from your perspective. I'm nothing. I have no identity of my own. I'm just a shliach. I'm just an emissary. I'm just an extension. Really, I'm an extension of the luminary. Like a ray is an extension of the light within the sun. And once you're able to identify who you are at your core and everything's okay, once you are able to identify this, who you are at your core, you become much more cool with yourself. Yeah, tranquillo. You become much more, okay, I know who I am, and I know, now I know what steps to take. And that's really what we're trying to establish. Somebody have a question? Aristia, you had a question?
Right. Yeah. What about the angels that allegedly do have names?
Okay, so that's a good question. It's a little bit beyond the scope. I shouldn't have brought it up. It's a little bit. I'll answer that question after. But their names reflect their essence. But we'll get into. I'll get into that. But now it's actually very good.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, so the second soul is literally a piece of God, and we're going to try to chelik elika. Literally a piece of God. What does that mean? And we're going to get into what that means. Like the pasuk says, "V'yapach ba'afiv nishmas chai." It says that Hashem blew the neshama, the soul of Adam, into the body. We know that God creates the world through speech. When you speak, you could speak for a very long time. But if you breathe deep from it, if you're trying to blow, when you blow from deep within you, you're going to get tired very quickly because it comes from a very deep place. It says that Adam Arishon, Adam had the soul before the Chet Eitz Hadas, before the sin of the tree. As you know, it's not really a sin, but before, just to use a borrowed term, the sin of the tree. It says that Adam, the Gemara says that Adam had a soul, a Jewish soul. What's a Jewish soul? This nefesh hashenis, literally a soul of a piece of God. What does that mean? And it had a soul that saw no existence outside of itself. It was pure godliness. There was no animalistics. There was no animal soul. He was translucent, says the Gemara. His skin was translucent, which reflected on what was going on the inside. He was completely transparent, as I should say. He was transparent. He was purely godliness. Until he ate from the tree of knowledge, then it says there was a mixture of tov and ra. Everything in the world has good and it has bad mixed together. Bad meaning that which covers over godliness. Klipa, etc. So it says that God, Hashem, now we know a little bit about where the soul comes from. The yipach ba'apiv nishmas chayim. He blew the soul into Adam's body. And what's another pasuk? Va'ata nefachta bi. As we say every day in the Birchas HaShachar and the blessing, the morning blessings, Hashem, you blew the soul within me. And actually, that pasuk talks about the change. We read it every day in the morning brachas. Yeah, and we go into it. You're familiar with that? Again, it's another pasuk. You blew the soul within me. One Zohar says one that blows from his innards. Pirush, from the depths of himself. The depths of a person, when a person blows, it comes from the depths of the person. So that's where we see this concept of the soul comes from deep within God. Now, this is all metaphorical. God doesn't actually have breath. Don't think he has breath and don't think he has innards, so to speak. But he has whatever that means in the spiritual world. That's what he has. So here's one place we see that the soul comes from deep within God. Now here comes another mashal, another parable of where the soul. We have other psukim that talk about where the soul comes from. Kach al derech mashal nishmas Yisrael alu b'machshava. It says that the Jewish people, their soul was alu b'machshava, came up into God's thoughts. What's the difference between thoughts and speech? We talk about it all the time. Speech reveals. Why do you speak? To tell for another person. It reveals what you're thinking, or only a little bit of what you're thinking, a fraction of what you're feeling, a fraction of what you're thinking. It reveals it to another. It's there to serve another. But your thoughts, I can't see your thoughts, just like you can't see my thoughts. You don't see my thoughts until I say them to you. Some people shouldn't always say their thoughts. But thoughts, your mind, is for you. It's within you. Right? It's within your world, within your universe. So here it says the soul of a Yisrael, alu b'machshava, comes from machshava, God's thought. And not just any place in thought, the highest level of thought. B'nei b'choyer Yisrael, it says, the Yidden, the Jewish people, are my firstborn child. And you might think, okay, they're like my child, children. But what does it mean? What is a child? People who know a little bit about where reproduction, where does it all begin? When a drop of semen, where does it all begin? It begins in the mind. It begins in the mind. And we're going to get into it. B'nei atim la'avai alikechem, your children to God, pirush. K'moisha ben nimshach l'mayach ha'av. A child comes from the father's brain. Same thing, we come from Hashem's mind. Comes from Hashem's brain. So the way it works, I don't know, I never took science, but I learned a little Torah. First of all, the soul is in the brain. Yeah, I don't know. We'll get into that. But when a person is when semen is formed, when semen is formed, it starts in the brain. It starts somewhere in the brain, and that's because it grabs the essence. The Torah explains it grabs the essence of the person at that point, and the essence of the person is situated in the brain, and so it grabs from that's where it starts. That's where it starts, and then it grabs and in the brain it has once you have the essence, you have all the entire. It says a little. If you grab a little bit of the essence, you have the entire essence. So the semen only needs to grab, or so to speak, whatever, I don't exactly know what it's called, in that primordial state, but it grabs from the essence, and you have everything there. Once you have the essence, you have the entire person there. So here we see that the fact that we have three mashalim over here. Number one, we come from the innards of God. That's again because He blew the soul. And then we have another passage that says we came within God's thoughts. Again, thoughts is still within the world of the person. Yeah, it's not outside, it's within the world. Unlike speech, like the rest of the world was created with speech, the animal soul is created with speech. Speech is a fraction of what goes on in your mind. And we have another thing, it says, B'nai B'chayri, we're like a firstborn child, we're like a child of God. And a child comes from deep within the essence from the essence. It's grabbed from the essence, which is in the brain. Now, you have to understand the difference between God, the way God is, how He relates to His thoughts, and how we relate to our thoughts. Our thoughts are something somewhat in a certain way, they're within ourselves, but they're something separate, right? Like it's just another tool in our body, in our tool chest, in our little tool chest. It's just another tool. Yeah, we have the tool of speech, we have a tool of hearing, thoughts and feelings. There are different tools that we could use to help us. Anger perhaps could be a tool. Love is a tool that we could use to enhance our relationships with God, with other people. But with God and His thoughts are one and the same. Elohu chachmas hayechad. Like it says in the Rambam. Let's see. What does the Rambam say about thoughts? Shehu hamada b'hu hayodeya b'davar ze ein b'yachaltes adam la'avinay al barif yizbarach. Hashem is not only the knower, but He is the knowledge, and He is the knowing. There's nothing else outside of God. God created, part of creation is knowledge. Knowledge is a creation. Knowing something is a creation. That's part of creation. When God created the world, that was also created. Like time was created. Change, feelings, emotions. So God only has to understand Himself. By understanding Himself, He understands you by what's going on. We're merely extensions of God. And the Alter Rebbe deals with all this trippy stuff in what's called Sharicha Ve'amuna in the second book, which, if you ever seen the movie The Matrix, there's a lot of good mashalim and a lot of good parables from that movie. Do we really exist? What does it mean if God is, it says, Ani Havai Nisi, I, God, have never changed. There's nothing else outside of God. But for this discussion at this point, the only thing that you need to know, and which is true, and it's fine, is that God is the knower and God is the knowledge. God is completely unified with His thoughts. Unlike us, thoughts are also unified with us, but they're also separate. They're just a tool in the chest. But with God, He's completely unified with his thoughts. And the Rambam says something interesting, just in case you're like, dude, I don't understand what you're saying. This is not anything that we can understand. A human being cannot. We don't understand what this thought means. Just like what was the world before God created it? What was it like? You can't think of that. What is beyond time? We have no idea because we're limited beings. And since we're limited beings, we only think in limited terms. So this whole concept of thinking God is completely unified with His thoughts. He's completely bound up to His essence just as much as any other part of Him is bound up to His essence. We don't understand what that means. But nevertheless, it's true. It says, here's a proof that like you can't understand what the God's ways. If you search after God, are you going to find Him? says in Iyov, and it says, "Ki lo yimachshavosei machshavosechem." Don't think that your thoughts are like God's thoughts. That's in Yeshayahu and Isaiah. Don't think your thoughts are like God's thoughts. God does not think in the same way that you think or I think. It's way beyond that. So here, that was three mashalim of where we come from. But I think we laid some groundwork over here that it's okay that you have a Yetzer Hara. Your default is not your godly soul. We know a little bit about where the godly soul comes from. Deep within it comes from the God's essence, and that doesn't fully come in until you're 13. And yeah, I think we covered a little bit right there. Anybody have any questions? Okay, I'm going to stop there because what's going to happen is, the next part is going to be what's called a machloikis, a disagreement between the Rambam, or seemingly a disagreement between the Rambam and Mikubalim. Mikubalim is, in English, are Kabbalists. The Kabbalists say that God is pshitas, simplicity, and therefore he has no parts. The Rambam says God he's a knower, he's got knowledge, he's a knower, he's the subject. Seemingly like these tools, there's like some sort of sophistication and complexity. But we're going to resolve that. The Rambam was not considered a Kabbalist. The Rambam was considered a philosopher. That then at the time, right, the Zohar wasn't revealed, right? We talked to people. Some people knew. People did know about it. Certain select people from the times of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, really from the times of Avraham, taught the Zohar to select people. You didn't necessarily have to be the biggest genius. You didn't necessarily mean you were the biggest genius of the generation that knew the Zohar. It was a certain type of character that you had, and you were taught the Zohar. Now, the Zohar became fully accepted by the Jewish people, soon after the Rambam, when it became more prevalent, 400 years later. But the Rambam was a philosopher. He didn't have the Zohar, so he would philosophize about who God is. What is God? I mean, of course, he would use psukim. He would use sources from the Torah. And he wasn't the only one. Ralbag, there were other people who were called philosophers, choikrim. So they have different approaches, it seems. But really, Alter Rebbe is going to come and say that they're really saying the same thing, just from the different side of the coin. And we'll get into that next week. Okay, anybody have any questions? All right, I think that's enough. I'll try to keep it short content, and we'll continue next week. Okay, so tomorrow we'll continue with Chassidus about the month of Elul, and if you have any questions, just text me. I'm trying to find my eraser over here. All right, my cursor. All right, everybody, you should have a good evening, and I can only find if I can end the recording, that would be good. You can ask me any questions until I turn it off. What is going on here? Where is it? There we go.